Hi everyone, and welcome to the second edition of our Intereach Spring Webinar Series. I'm Christine Glauber, and I'm chair of the Intereach webinar. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Jacqueline Smith. So Jacqueline is the Associate Vice President of University Initiatives at Arizona State University. In her role, she designs and launches university-wide initiatives related to leadership development, student success, workforce development, and online learning communities. And I first came across Jacqueline's work in an article published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, which was entitled Intrapreneurship in Higher Education. And for those of you wondering if I just misspoke, I did indeed say intrapreneurship. And I'm going to let Jacqueline define it for us in her own words and in her understanding. And so in this article, she outlined some lessons learned from applying these intrapreneurship principles to academic institutions, which in my mind align well with the work we do in our community of practice here at Intereach, particularly in the development, formalization, and communication of our field as I2S professionals. So please go ahead and join me in welcoming Jacqueline Smith. And if you didn't hear me as we were getting started, if you, I just see that Christine says, sorry, Christine, do you want to take your moment to have it, to take some announcements or to give us some announcements, or do you want to?
Oh, thanks, Christine.
Sorry.
Oh, no, that's totally fine. I just wanted to let everybody know something that I think you may already know, which is that registration for the 2019 Science of Team Science meeting is open now in Lansing, Michigan in May 20th through 23rd of this year. So we are a new special interest group of the Science of Team Science community, which is Insights. And although we've been around for a few years now, just wanted to put a plug that you can join Insights as a member now, and you can select Intereach as a special interest group when you do that if you want to. And so just wanted to take this opportunity to update anyone who may not have heard about that. It's exciting. We're going to be able to use that opportunity to really grow as a community of practice, the way that Christine mentioned. You know, we're here to raise the platform for several different career paths around this type of effort. So just a plug for Intereach as a SIG, and to say that we always have a really great time meeting at the Science of Team Science meeting. So we hope that people are able to join in May in Lansing. That's it.
Thanks, Christine.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of that real quick, I guess we can join up to 2 special interest groups when you join as a member of Insights. So hopefully Intereach is one of those. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. Join me in welcoming Jacqueline Smith. And yeah, like I was saying, if you've got any questions, if there are burning questions, go ahead and type them in the chat. And but otherwise, let's try to hold them until the end of Jacqueline's presentation. Okay, thanks, Jacqueline.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. I'm really happy to speak with you today. And I thought I would start by sharing a question that really motivates me every day. And I am going to see, my slides are advancing. There we go. So I've been at ASU since 2009, and the question that my office, the Office of University Initiatives, wakes up to every day is, what if universities were as nimble as startups? If we were able to pivot rapidly, reimagine our roles, and really understand our marketplace at speed. And so the Office of University Initiatives at Arizona State University was created by President Michael Crow when he joined ASU in 2002. He was at Columbia University before coming to ASU, and he spent some time at a variety of other universities and felt that too often universities would need to say no to emerging opportunities because a lack of time, a lack of resources, a lack of interest, fear of the unknown, And so he wanted to establish an office with a name vague enough to encapsulate emerging opportunities, new initiatives. He also wanted this office to advance what he called his design aspirations for the university. So some of you may know that since 2002, President Crow has been on a mission to make the university much more inclusive and accessible, while also rapidly increasing our research portfolio and our presence and impact in our surrounding communities and global communities. And he did this by establishing 8 design aspirations. So the Office of University Initiatives was meant to launch new projects in response to emerging needs, but also launch demonstration projects of those 8 design principles, which include valuing entrepreneurship, being socially embedded, student success, etc. When the office was first founded in 2002, there were a few staff and many students. And in 2009, we launched a program called the University Innovation Fellowship, which I'll speak about in a little bit. And that is the point when I joined the university in 2009. I thought I would be here for that 1-year fellowship, and I'm now approaching my 10th year at the university because I really believe in the way that we work and the values that I've outlined here. So the team is full of individuals who have taken different paths to join the office. We come from a variety of academic backgrounds. I myself am a lawyer by training who in undergrad studied math and economics. And we have a variety of folks in different disciplines, ranging from design to education to business to communications, etc. I think of the team in terms of how we leverage some of the items that are mentioned here: design thinking, rapid research skills, and collaboration. So the talk that I'm going to give today is in response to the work that I've been doing at ASU for about 10 years, advancing new initiatives out of this office, which is part of the Office of the President. And I will speak a little bit more about the University Innovation Fellowship later on in the presentation, but I do want to note here that applications for this fellowship are open, and this is the website if you're interested in learning more, ui.asu.edu/fellowship. So when I speak about intrapreneurship, I am referring to the definition that really resonates with me is from Pamela Hartigan and Charmian Love, which is internal change agents who embrace entrepreneurship in the context of a large organization. In 2014, when I co-authored the Stanford Social Innovation article with Nikki Guz and Ryan Borden, we had come together realizing that although we had 3 separate roles at ASU, we felt as though we shared some common traits. And after coming together in mini workshops to discuss what we thought was common and the message that we wanted to share in this article, we realized that we all generated ideas in a rapid way, and that our supervisors looked to us to generate those ideas. So in my case, I report to President Crow, and Ryan and Nikki were reporting to the Dean of the College of Education at the time. So we work on generating ideas. We also work on integrating ideas across the university and accelerating the advancement of ideas. So generally, when I think about the actions that intrapreneurs take, I think about generate, integrate, and accelerate. And in 2014, this was really part of the heyday of entrepreneurship programs at universities. And for a time, my portfolio included helping students learn more about entrepreneurship, launch their own businesses and nonprofit ventures, and the rise of social entrepreneurship at universities was really taking shape. And we started thinking about the consequences of spinning ideas out of major organizations as opposed to maintaining ideas within the organizations in order to create an innovative culture and in order to maintain and perhaps increase affinity to the institution and to enable continuous improvement. So we started looking into what it would mean if we were fostering more intrapreneurs at the university, and we learned that there were other groups taking on similar causes, and in the corporate world, the intrapreneurship concept, corporate entrepreneurship, was starting to take shape. We learned that there's something called the League of Intrapreneurs. Communities of practice began to form. And when Christine reached out to me about this webinar, I realized that you all are forming this community of practice, and I'll be interested during the Q&A to discuss how and whether you feel this term is applicable to the work that you're doing in team science and the work that you're doing to bridge different units across the university in a research context and in other contexts. So I'd like to just provide one example of a project that my office has worked on to establish a network. And this is a bit of a meta example in that the way my office is working has been an example of entrepreneurship, and we then created a community of practice for other connectors, accelerators, integrators, and generators. So we created another community of practice for social embeddedness. So I mentioned social embeddedness as one of our design aspirations. Over the last 2 decades, many universities have evaluated their role in their local communities and have worked to switch from a purely service model or a one-way outreach model where the university is diving into a community, and that runs the risk of a university being seen as only parachuting in when it's good for them, working on a semester schedule as opposed to a timeline that's more appropriate for the community. And also the risk of not appreciating the assets that the community brings to bear and really just focusing on its needs and how the university can provide support. So when President Crow established his vision in 2002 for his presidency and for the new path of Arizona State University, one of his design aspirations was social embeddedness, that rather than parachuting in, we would be a university that would be consistently embedded in the community and that would advance mutually beneficial partnerships to advance change. And so over time, a variety of community engagement professionals have emerged at the university in different units, ranging from service learning to research to each academic college. And as you can see, the challenge that we were trying to solve is that we do not have a central function to track all that we're doing in the community and to enable our continuous improvement. And for President Crow, he wants to establish a model, a new model of higher education. And in order to let other universities see the results of working towards these 8 design aspirations, we need to be able to show what we've done over time. And for our own learning and to ensure that we are hitting the mark for the commitments that we've made to be socially embedded, we want to figure out how to more systematically track our impacts and course correct as needed. So often when a project comes to our office, it will be because President Crow has identified a challenge or has identified an emerging opportunity. And right now we're looking at an internal challenge, and I'm happy to also provide examples of emerging opportunities that are shared with my office as well. So typically when a challenge or opportunity is brought to our office, we will think through the root questions that motivate that challenge. And this idea of beautiful questions is inspired by Warren Berger's book, A More Beautiful Question. And its subtitle is The Power of Inquiry to Spark Breakthrough Ideas. And Berger encourages the reader to question the status quo through a series of 3 questions. He says that most innovators begin by asking why. So they challenge the status quo. They ask why a situation is the way that it is. And then they begin to ask what if. That's their first step in putting an idea out there in a whimsical way that is meant to be iterated upon. And then they begin to ask questions of how might we begin to make change. So when we identify a challenge or an opportunity, we first ask questions of why. Why is the situation the way that it is? So we ask, why have we streamlined our engagement with corporate partners and research partners, but we have a decentralized model with community partners who may include municipalities, nonprofit organizations, and in some cases, businesses as well that want to work with us on a corporate social responsibility manner. So these are some examples of the kinds of questions we might ask. We might start by challenging the status quo with why questions, and then move to a what if question. What if ASU could engage with the community at the pace and scale of our fast-moving and ever-growing society? And in groups that we assemble with members from across the university, with community partners, we may then go through a design process where we begin to explore these questions and then move into more of a active brainstorm where we're getting into the how to solve them. And in this talk, I won't be, in my formal remarks, providing more information about design thinking. But if you have some questions about design thinking at the end, or if that is a new term for you, please let me know, because it's very central to the work that we do in university initiatives. And I was looking through some of the resources that you have on Intereach, and I saw there were some brainstorming maps, and there was an activity that some of your colleagues put together that involved putting together ideas and then creating a tree where other people build on those ideas. And I see that as very much related to a iterative and generative process that we would use in what we would call design thinking. So I think there's a lot of alignment in the practices that many of us use. So just as an example, as a result of asking some of the aforementioned questions, we've helped truly create a community of practice for the many individuals who are currently in a decentralized manner engaging with community partners. And we have, for the past 2 years, gathered this community of practice at a conference, and the group has indicated continued interest in learning from each other. And in particular, when we find that many different faculty are working with the same community partner but are not necessarily aligning their projects, the in-person meetings provide space for individuals to realize where there may be overlap and actually begin to outline ways that they might want to collaborate. Because that meeting happens once a year, and then we have monthly brown bag meetings, and there's a lot of opportunity for learning in between those in-person sessions. We also connect with each other digitally, and we have put together a newsletter, again, to create a more cohesive community, just as you have created a community of practice with Intereach. And so as we look at our process over time, I wanted to point out that although we speak at ASU a lot about speed, and I even mentioned that in our what if question, that we want to be responsive to our community partners at speed, the work of intrapreneurship is not necessarily always quick in that you can make university-wide change in 6 months. So here you can see that our work in creating a social embeddedness network has been evolving since 2014. Really the light bulb moment for us in 2014 was we went through the Carnegie Community Engagement process, which for any of you who have gone through that at your university, you'll know it's a year-long process, very similar to an audit, in which you evaluate all of your community engagement practices. And after earning the classification, we realized that we had a substantial report that we had given to this body, but we hadn't used the time to reflect and make a plan for how we wanted to change. And we had created a 100-page document that we knew would not be widely distributed, but was very rich in information. And that's when we realized that every year we had more of a story to tell for social embeddedness. And so it moved us to create the collateral pieces that you see on your screen. And with each year when we produce the collateral, new people emerge who feel that we are on the right track with the way that we're building our narrative, or have constructive criticism for how we're building our narrative. And this is how we, again, move to continue to form this community of practice of individuals whose day-to-day job is really influenced by this social embeddedness design aspiration. So again, I want to say that we have this balance between a sense of urgency and an understanding that building a community takes time, and that the work of intrapreneurs can also really take time. So I mentioned the University Innovation Fellowship. I would like to come back to that. And each year, we are looking for early to mid-career professionals who've completed a master's or doctoral degree in the last 5 years. You can see some of the disciplines that we've had people from. And these individuals complete a 13-month fellowship where they will work on generating, integrating, and accelerating ideas. Some relate to social embeddedness, others to global engagement. Some ideas are literally ideas that President Crow has put on Post-its or on the back of envelopes or on napkins that get sent to us, and we are starting from scratch. Others have been more grounded in discussion and have been germinating for a time at the university, and we look to then help birth those ideas into the university. And so I mention this both in case you or colleagues are interested in the fellowship, but also to point out that who intrapreneurs are at a university will really vary. And this is one slice of who intrapreneurs are at ASU. President Crow refers to the Innovation Fellows sometimes as troublemakers, change agents, those who really stir up getting individuals to work in new ways. And I welcome a discussion about who the intrapreneurs are on your campus. And at ASU, since President Crow's arrival, I think that there are many factors that have attracted people to come and work at ASU. And two important ones are, one, our charter, which emphasizes that we want to measure ourselves by who we include, not by who we exclude. And that's a reference to some universities really priding themselves on having low acceptance rates as a sign of prestige. And we emphasize that we are growing and accepting more students over time because of the urgent need to produce more individuals with a post-secondary credential. And that is attractive to many people and brings them to ASU. And I know that in 2009, it was both the charter and the second component that brought me here, which is an appetite for ideas and a culture where ideas are really celebrated, and that it's not scary to bring up an idea. And I mentioned that I have a background in law. And when I was a summer associate at a firm, I had a few ideas about how I wanted to advance my career, launch new initiatives at the firm. And there was a culture of waiting your turn, and I was told that it would take several years before I would have the appropriate place in line to launch new ideas at the firm. And I was really hungry and certainly want to be respectful to those who have been there before me and would want to work collaboratively with others. But I wanted my ideas to have airtime and the space to be heard, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. And I think that this fellowship is one way to attract individuals who are in alignment with our university charter, but also share a commitment to advancing ideas and celebrating the ideas of others. So now we'll get into a couple concepts related to entrepreneurship, and one is this idea of insiders versus outsiders. So I have looked at how skunkworks units have been formed over time, how corporations have created innovation units. And there are times when innovation is seen as something that is separate from the core function of the enterprise. And they're put into this kind of separate space to be creative while others work on the core business or the core purpose of their enterprise. And I think there are pros and cons to having insiders who are responsible for generating ideas, accelerating ideas, and having outsiders do that. And so questions that I offer to you for your own reflection as you think about whether you yourselves are insiders or outsiders, or if you are more, I see you use this language of boundary spanners. And so some of you may straddle the line between working on the inside and working on the outside. So one way of thinking about how entrepreneurs accelerate and generate ideas at a university in order to create internal change at that university is to examine their connection with senior leadership, while also examining how close they are to the front line. And in a university context, that may be working directly with students, or directly working with faculty, or directly working with community partners, depending on the nature of the role. I'll pose a few questions that I hope could be useful to you as you think about your own entrepreneurial context. University Initiatives, the office that I'm the executive director of, is one that straddles both an insider and outsider approach. I think that many times people assume because we're from the office of the president that we really rely on that cachet and rely on the power of central administration to make change. But very often we take more of a grassroots approach in partnering with others at the university and really understanding their needs. But I also think that we have a lot of privilege in that we do not, on a day-to-day basis, have a student services operation to be responsible for, or have to produce and hit certain research targets. And so in that way, we are also acting like outsiders, in that we're free from some of the pressures that others feel in order to contribute to the enterprise. Our purpose is to work on special projects, bubbling new initiatives, and we are given the space to work on that. So in some ways, we are similar to how a skunkworks team might be isolated from the rest of the university, but the way in which we work, the design thinking principles that we utilize are very user-centered, and that is what drives us to also serve as insiders as well. Another question that I think is important to reflect on as you are assessing the entrepreneurial landscape of your university is what actually constitutes a good idea. I find that when I am in brainstorming sessions with individuals, I realize that sometimes we can be talking past each other because we have a different view of what the North Star is that we're chasing. For some, a good idea is one that will generate revenue or increase relationships with a partner or enable us to achieve scale. And I find that there are many differences in how rapidly to achieve scale and the appetite to prototype an idea with 50 students versus 500 students. How quickly will you get to 1,000 students? There are many different opinions about what is appropriate scale, what is a reasonable scale to reach, and in what time frame. And I find that it's important to level set with individuals at the start to understand the motivators about what will be deemed a good idea. And for some, the best idea is one that has the most obvious mission alignment. And for us, our mission at ASU is very much tied to increasing accessibility and increasing research capacity. So for us, mission and scale are often hand in hand. Another reflection question is to look at how and whether your university enables continuous increases in idea generation. And related, I would be interested to know how each of you as individuals enable your own idea generation productivity to increase over time. What are you doing to give yourself the space to be creative? And what are you doing to provide others with the space to be generative in their ideas? I know at a very micro level for myself, I work to try to not have meetings on Fridays and use that as one of the main creative days in my week. As you might imagine, it's not always possible to do that, but even if there can be a half day of time for creative thinking, I've found that it's very difficult to be generative when I have 30 minutes here or there in between meetings. I also personally have found that I find it easier to make connections between ideas when I'm moving around. So after I've done yoga, or sometimes I will go on a walk in order to be able to, again, make those connections, reflect on what I've been learning, look at notes that I've taken from conversations that I've had with different people in order to synthesize it. And in that process of looking at notes, I may take breaks in order to bring movement into my practice. And so it's a question that one might not ask. Sometimes people think that you're either creative or you're not, or you are an ideator or you're not. But it may be that you're not giving yourself the enabling environment to be generative. And you may want to ask questions of others to find out what's generative for them. Some people like to work in coffee shops, for example. They like to be stimulated. Others prefer quiet. And with an office of about 10 people, fellows, researchers, communicators, operations, I have very different personalities, and we all like to generate in different ways. And so I spend time making sure that I'm meeting everyone's needs so that we can be as generative as possible. So I've mentioned this concept without naming it a few times, idea advocacy. And at the bottom of the screen, I note a book that has really influenced and affirmed a lot of my thinking about entrepreneurship, written by Kevin D'Souza. And in the foreword to that book, Thomas Davenport says, "Ideas don't grow like crops in specified fields during specified seasons. They can come from anyone at any time. But like crops, they do need to be nurtured." So just as I was talking about how you create space to be generative, I also really appreciate D'Souza's concept of idea advocacy, and provide a few questions for how you can assess whether or not there's a culture for being able to advocate for your own ideas and advocating for the ideas of others. So when ideas are being discussed, are your colleagues talking about their own ideas primarily? Or do you find that colleague A might enthusiastically talk about an idea of colleague B at lunchtime? And how do you enable the celebration of other people's ideas? And when you see that happening, perhaps that would encourage someone who hasn't opened up about an idea to do so, because they know that they are in a supportive environment. In order to celebrate ideas, you first need to take time to listen to each other. So how is space being created to listen to different ideas? And do you find that most people want to listen once an idea is more fully baked? Or is there an environment where it's okay to speak about a little seedling of an idea that hasn't really been nurtured yet? And similarly, how do people make decisions about their time in figuring out how to really champion new ideas that may not be tied to their daily responsibilities? And these principles, again, are tied to this concept of idea advocacy. And I, again, look forward to hearing from you about how some of these concepts relate to your work as fostering team environments and enabling the success of teams. So a couple more slides here as we wrap up. So in D'Souza's book, he actually uses a pyramid model to talk about the range of levels of maturity of entrepreneurship in an organization. And my team and I modified that pyramid to create this graphic instead. And he identifies these 3 levels of maturity of entrepreneurship in an organization. And I offer these to you as you reflect on what level of maturity you think you might have at your organization. And we can look at 3 factors when assessing the maturity of entrepreneurship in an organization. Whether or not there are processes in place. So an ad hoc level would be more chaotic. You may have individual entrepreneurs who, when they see problems, are working diligently to try to address them. You may see them as these superheroes who come in and are able to really lift mountains out of nowhere, but there are no university processes in place that are there to enable their success. And so when those individuals leave, those practices go with them. But as you move along the line, you'll see that a variety of processes are in place, and they may begin at a very localized level, and they may be department specific at first. But when they really begin to, in my mind, since I want universities to be more like startups, where they really start to get interesting, is when you start to see processes that enable collaboration across departments or across the entire organization. And then the optimized level is when there not only do the processes exist, but there's a commitment to continuously improving those processes over time. In the reactive category, there may be a specific problem like this that the superhero is solving in the ad hoc category. But in the reactive category, it may be that the problem is very much local to that department. And until the processes become more university-wide, the practices in place will be very much specific to that department. And so if that individual were to shift, it may be difficult for that person to succeed because the political environment may be different, the norms of that office may be different, and the problems may be very localized and specific to the needs of that unit. And so although efficiency of that department may improve over time, the enterprise overall may not be affected because of the lack of coordination across units. I mentioned that in our office, sometimes we identify a problem, such as the lack of connectivity amongst community engagement professionals, which encourage us create the Social Embeddedness Network. But we are also opportunity-oriented. And so very quickly, I'll share that an example of an emerging opportunity that was one of the very exciting moments of my time at ASU is when President Crow heard Tom Brokaw giving a speech about public service and the role of universities. And Mr. Brokaw announced that it would be his vision that universities across the United States would create public service academies, which would be hubs where emerging public service professionals would receive training and would be inspired to launch into a public service career. And President Crow went up to him and said, "We at ASU will build the first public service academy for you." And shortly after President Crow had that interaction, I was asked to go to his office, and he said, "Your assignment is to build a public service academy." And this was an emerging opportunity to respond to this call and to then understand the market. What are we already doing to prepare young people for public service? What's missing? Where can we fill the gaps? And after several years, that opportunity then resulted in the actual launch of the academy, and we will have our first graduating class this May from that program. The third and final factor here in looking and evaluating the maturity of entrepreneurship at an organization is understanding the returns. So I mentioned that until the practices of entrepreneurship and processes are university-wide, the impacts will be very localized. And as entrepreneurship is more enabled in an organization over time, D'Souza and I would agree, think that an institution is able to maintain a competitive advantage because when there is an optimized enablement of entrepreneurs throughout an institution, there is that commitment to continuous improvement and opportunity identification. So I will conclude by reminding some of you of some of the reflection questions that I've posed for you to perhaps discuss in your own Intereach community and with others at your university. Who are the entrepreneurs? Do you have individuals that are like the fellows, or do entrepreneurs look different at your institution? How do you know? What signals it to them? I've offered that I see entrepreneurs as the individuals who are generating and accelerating and integrating ideas. But you can also identify them based on with whom they collaborate and their output. I've also encouraged you to reflect on what constitutes a good idea and how you enable continuous increases in idea generation and sharing and idea advocacy. And then finally, in response to the stages of entrepreneurship, I'll encourage you to think about the resources that are currently allocated at your institution to sustain an entrepreneurial culture. And I appreciate your time very much in getting to introduce this topic with you, and I will stop the screen share now in order to take your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. That was fascinating. I want to open up the floor to anyone that has questions.
Hi, I have a question. This is Amanda Vogel. Hi, I'm a contractor at National Cancer Institute. My question is, do you have any thoughts on how individuals who aren't at the top of an organization can help to shape the culture towards some of these values around openness to entrepreneurship from those who are not at the top?
Yes. So I have a few thoughts. One would be to begin by first collecting the stories of successful entrepreneurs. I think that elevating those stories and showing that perhaps you may be more in the ad hoc or localized stage of entrepreneurship at an organization. But part of why you may be more localized is because the leadership may not be familiar with these concepts or may not know that there's an opportunity to celebrate those individuals, and may not know that in order to make the next jump to the next level, the amount of resources that need to be established may not need to be significant. You don't necessarily need to create a new office like my own right from the start. It could be about creating space for those initial emerging entrepreneurs to connect more regularly, or providing professional development related to idea advocacy, brainstorming, and how to be more generative in the workspace. So I would say identifying those stories and, if you can, inviting those people to connect, to share some of what they've done, potentially even in like a brief case format. What problems have you been solving? What questions have you been asking? What has been your outcomes? And what are your needs? And once those stories are organized, you can begin to see that a community has formed, and you may be able to create a little bit more momentum.
I've got a question. I also thought that was just fascinating. I really enjoyed your presentation. And I guess my question is about, personally, I love to follow ASU and President Crow. I mean, one of the things that always stands out to me is anybody that I ever talk to or visit with from ASU knows President Crow by name and has like a very strong understanding, always mentions him as a human and also his vision for, how the university is shaped. And so in your case, you have such a strong advocate for, not utilizing the rules of how things have done before to the extent that they're not useful to getting us where we need to go. However, there's a lot of places, I would say every single other place then at ASU, that's still only pretty much all of these other things are definitely sometimes supported and wildly appreciated. Duke University, where I am, I would count among those places. But in the end, when it comes to APT, it is still grants and publications that decides a person's future in academia. And so I wonder if you could speak to not what are your ideas to overhaul all of academia, because I feel like that's too much to ask a person, but can you just talk about ASU and what things are counted in APT and what are the workarounds for your university to allow people to actually have metrics that are rewarded so that these really important contributions to community are not ultimately a tax on producing the metrics that will count whether you're successful or not?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. And I'd like to follow up with you in a little more detail by email, in part because I'm not a faculty member. I do teach, but I'm not evaluated according to those systems. So I'd like to compile some information from different units and get back to you with more specificity. But what I've heard President Crow share and what I've heard from others is that the tenure process is certainly evolving. And I know that there are different practices in place within each of the different colleges. And one example of a interdisciplinary group, arts, media, and engineering. There's a fellow in the University Initiative who one of his ideas was to imagine how we might embrace the positivity and optimism and exploration of science fiction and apply that to the way that we think about our own future and the way that we inspire future scientists and really enable this embracive imagination. And he developed this concept, and after his fellowship, this was launched into the Center for Science and the Imagination. And he then became the director of that center and also began the tenure process. And you may even want to speak with him directly. His name is Ed Finn. And so he is an example of an entrepreneur who was straddling these worlds, working to launch a new initiative that had been supported by this office and by President Crow, while also needing to fall in line with the demands that were expected of him by his faculty colleagues, by his dean, and others. But part of why the Arts, Media, and Engineering unit was a safe and very welcoming landing space for him is that that is one in particular that has really embraced a variety of newer ways of evaluating someone's impact and service to university and, in general, their own output. Other questions, comments? I also welcome criticisms or concerns. Really eager to hear from you.
Hey, Jacqueline, this is Christine again. So
Hi.
I have a question for you. Just, you know, you sort of described some of your work, and even those of the fellows, they've been sort of described as these troublemakers. They're kind of going against the grain. And in such an environment as an academic institution, which is, you know, very much steeped in tradition, like, what suggestions might you have if there is a particularly loud group of dissenters? You know, I think within team science, within the team science field, we definitely run up against a lot of folks that that have all kinds of reasons of why it's you know, I already do that, or yeah. So I'm just curious, what suggestions do you have for that?
So I think for many of us, our instinct is to convert the dissenters. But I think that, you know, if possible, I think it's best to focus energy on strengthening the allies as opposed to converting the dissenters. Now, where it's really tricky and perhaps creates a stalemate is when the dissenters are in positions of power based on title. But then we could have a conversation about, well, what are the other forms of power and what are the other forms of influence? So, so part one, is it necessary to engage the dissenters? If you've concluded that it is necessary to engage those dissenters, then other than I already do that, I'd be interested to know, like, what is the nature of the dissent? And at the root, is it fear? What other sources of apprehension are really creating the unwillingness to collaborate? And when President Crow first arrived at ASU, there were certainly dissenters and there was certainly fear. And I've heard him say that he looked at it as those who wanted to leave would leave and those who wanted to stay would stay. And that he knew that he wanted to build a coalition of the willing, that the charter would attract people here, the idea culture would attract people here, and that he would reach a tipping point in which the culture would really start to shift and that the dissenters would become the minority. And I think that that was a really successful way of moving forward. And so happy to talk a little more offline or now if you want to provide a little more information about the nature of the dissent, but I think that I'd follow his lead in really just trying to bolster continued support. Now I know in his case, he's the president, and so he has some space to do that. Again, the power dynamic is something that needs to be considered, but I think that if you have the fortitude and the staying power, the dissenters may start to say, huh, you know, maybe there really is something here. Like you've really held your ground, you haven't given up, and let me look at the outcomes that you've produced. And those outcomes can really begin to speak for themselves. Should we take a final question, or do you think we should conclude?
If no one else has a final question, then maybe I could just ask you to plug one more time the fellowship. It sounded like it was open to more people beyond ASU, and I mean,
Yes.
it's a really interesting idea. So if you could possibly end with that information one more time, and then also we've got the question on the chat whether it's possible to get a copy of the slides.
Yes. Happy to share the slides, and I just posted the fellowship link. And so in early May, that's the deadline for the fellowship, and it's completely open to anyone around the world. And there's information on the website about our process, and we appreciate your interest in that opportunity. And I really thank everyone today for listening, and moving forward, would love to hear from you about any emerging thoughts that you have on this field and the connection to your work.
Great. Thank you guys so much. You can we'll be posting the recorded version of this on our website, intereach.org. And you can also find links to our old websites, old webinars on there as well. And just want to give one more heads up for our April event, which will be on April 9th, again at 12 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Yeah. Christine, any other interviews or